Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma daf lamed chet. Today's daf is sponsored by Jeremy Booty in loving memory of Yonatan Ezra ben Yarden Yehoshua Valea Dvorah on his yurtzeit. Today's daf is sponsored by Mindy Feldman Hechten family in loving memory of Dr. Charles Feldman, Zichrono Livracha, beloved husband, father, and Saba devoted doctor and communal leader. He would have found light in these dark days from Torah learning and strength from his family members currently serving Medina Israel. Now Hashem protect them and bring all the hostages home safely. Chanukah Sameach Umeil. Today's daf is dedicated by Debbie and Yossi Gvir to the refuah of their son-in-law Boaz Shlomo ben Shulamit Sarah, who was lightly wounded in Gaza on Shabbat morning, wishing him and all of our wounded in the war a refuah shlema. To all of Am Yisrael, niflot, v'yeshuot, niflot, u'nichamot. Today's daf is dedicated to the refuah shlema of Netanel Yaakov ben Yehudit Sarah, who was also injured in Gaza. Okay, with that, we will get started with our daf. Just a quick announcement. There will be no regular Zoom tomorrow morning, and Zoom will resume as usual on Tuesday, and the Shiur will be posted as usual. It'll actually be posted earlier in the morning by 5:30 a.m. Israel time, so you can learn early if that's good for you. Okay, we are going to get started with the top of our daf. A bunch of very interesting sugyot, and the first one is shor shel Yisrael shenagach shor shel Kanani patur. We have this strange halacha in the Mishnah, although maybe not always so strange because we've gotten used to seeing these sugyot about Gentiles and how it's treated differently than we might treat things today, which is if a Jewish ox gores a Canaanite's ox. Now, some people might have a different text. It says goyim or nochuri or akum. There's different texts that use different words, whether it's Knaani or, okay, either which way, it means some sort of Gentile, which part of that we're going to discuss actually not in the Gemara, but I will go off the daf a little bit into this topic because it's a very interesting topic. We have a Jewish ox that gores, let's just call it a Gentile's ox right now. The Jew is exempt. However, in the reverse case, if the Gentile's ox gores a Jewish ox, not only do they have to pay, but the rules of shor tam shor mu'ad do not apply. Basically, he has to pay full damages. So the Gemara says, and we're going to see right away, the Gemara just doesn't understand this. Why is this halakha, right? The same way it's kind of surprising to see it in the Mishnah. The Gemara is going to be surprised by it, and we're going to see it, number one, by the first question that they ask, and number two, they're going to have a story later which highlights, I would say, their discomfort with this halakha and how complicated it felt to them. And the story is really going to highlight that in a very strong way. So Amrei mimanavsha. So they say, we don't understand. Any which way you look at it, it doesn't make any sense. If we say the psukim are talking about only your friend, then it should mean, if it only is for your friend, all these laws, then it means only Jew to Jew, and not Jew to Gentile, and not Gentile to Jew. So basically, just like the Jew shouldn't have to pay the Gentile shouldn't have to pay the Jew in a court of Jewish law. And if we say Re'eu doesn't mean only Jew, well then, afilu d'Israel kinagach t'knani. Then if our ox gored one of a Gentile's ox, a Jewish ox to a Gentile ox should be obligated. So how do we resolve this? So we're going to have two different psukim, one by Rabbi Abau, one by Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rabbi Abau, Amarcha, Amad avi moded eretz. This is a pasuk in Chavakuk. God stood up and measured the world, the land. Ra'ah vayater goyim. He saw, and I'm going to explain what this pasuk is. Vayater from hitil, permitted, maybe something like that. Goyim. Okay, to yater is literally to untie. Okay, but it could also mean to release from obligation or something like that. So what does this mean? What does this have to do with our topic? Ra'ah, what did God see when he measured the land? Ra'ah sheva mitzvot shekiblu alehem b'nei Noach, kevan shelo kimu amad v'hitir mamonan liYisrael. So first you have to see, what did God see when he assessed the land? Number two, what did he do then as a result? So he saw that in this interpretation of the pasuk, he gave them the sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach, the 7 Noahide laws. They didn't keep them. So he said, if you don't keep them, well, your money is up for grabs by the Jews. Okay, which basically means, now, this could mean actually one of two things. This could mean that, therefore, the Jews don't have to pay you if they damage your animals, even though you have to pay them. Or it means, and the question is, what's the default? And we gave both options, and really both options could be read into here, and the commentaries differ on how to read it. Either which way, it really means the same thing, but it's interesting to think about conceptually. Does it mean, really, you were supposed to pay, and they were supposed to pay you, but they don't have to pay you because God hitir mamonam. They basically said, the Jews don't have to pay you damages. Or is it that no one really had to pay damages to anybody. But since you don't keep the Noahide laws, God basically made your money belong to the Jews if you're going to damage them. Obviously, it doesn't mean the Jews can go take their money anytime they want. What it means is if you damage, then the Jews can collect money from you. So either which way, it's getting to the same conclusion. It's just a matter of what's the default, what was before this. So now Rabbi Yochanan Amar Mehacha, he brings a different pasuk. Hofia Mehal Paran. Okay, this is in Ha'azinu, Parshat Ha'azinu. Mi Paran Hofia Mamonan liYisrael. Okay, what it really means is God came out from Har Paran and gave us the Torah. But what does it mean? He came from Paran. Why? Because in Paran, they didn't want to accept the Torah. In other words, he offered the Gentiles. Okay, there's a whole debate where exactly Paran is, what is Paran, but without getting into all that, God offered the Gentiles the Torah. They didn't want it. And therefore, God said, fine, you don't want to keep my commandments. It's kind of the same idea. It's just one is just the 7 Noahide laws, and the other is the whole Torah. They wouldn't keep, and God got angry for them for not wanting to keep the Torah, or not angry, but wanted to punish them. And therefore, again, their mammon became available to the Jews, which again means one of the two things we said before. Again, depending on what the default is, either which way you get to the fact that the Canaanites have to pay us for damages and we don't pay them. So now, what's the issue? What's going on here? Okay, well, before we ask this question, and what does this have to do with anything? Why is one go with the other? Okay, it's a very interesting question. Maybe we'll stop here before we see the Braita that basically says the same thing. But the Braita is going to take both those and bring them as if both are the answers to the question. Okay, but what's going on here? So the Meiri explains it very well, and then comes to a very interesting conclusion. Okay, so I want to read to you from the Meiri, it's the Beit HaBechira on the Bava Kamma. He says here, and this is something that's typical of the Meiri. Okay, we'll talk about it in a minute. He says basically, shor shel Yisrael has to do this. Why? She'en chasim al mamon zulatam. They don't really care about the money of others, these Gentiles. And therefore, konsimotam shelo yargilu atzmam lahazik. Okay, what does that mean? Let's go back to the basic. If they don't keep the 7 Noahide laws, do you remember what one of them is? One of them is to create a system of law. Basically, what the Meiri is saying is the Gemara is saying these people have no sense of law. There's no law governing them. Okay, this was the pagan culture that the Jews were living in at the time of the Gemara. There was this pagan culture with no real rule of law. And therefore, he said, Ulafima shenemar b'Gemara, davka ba'amimim she'enam gdulim b'darchei datot b'nimusim. These are people who don't have a religion or nimusim or it's like etiquette but what it really means is they don't have any ethical or moral code. But, right, as the Gemara said, in other words, what he basically says, it's obvious. If they don't keep the Sheva Mitzvot B'nei Noach, then what's going to happen? Their animals, if they have no system of law and no ethical or moral code or religious code, then they're basically going to let their animals do whatever they want and damage all the time. And we've already talked about that. You have to keep these hazardous animals off the street. It's dangerous, right? If we don't enforce this, then they will it's a free-for-all, and it'll be a nightmare to live in a culture like that. So therefore, now here's the big therefore. He says, Ume'ata ein tzarich lamar shekem be'umot hagdura. I'm sorry, I skipped the important line. Ha kol sheva mitzvot biyadam. But if they do keep those 7 mitzvot, it's then dinam etzleinu kidinenu etzlam. We have the exact same laws then. Okay, in other words, ein nosim panim b'din la'atzmeinu. Ume'ata ein tzarich lamar shekem be'umot hagdura b'darchei datot b'nimusim. He says if you have a Gentile who's part of a system of law, then this is all irrelevant. And he basically neutralizes this law entirely because he's living in Provence, where there's Christian rule, and there's rules, and there's regulations. And he basically, and why is this important? Because the Meiri does this in a lot of places. He says a lot of places where the Gemara talks about akum. Akum is of de kochavim umazalot, pagans. It doesn't mean all Gentiles. And in many, many sugyot, he basically neutralizes all the differences between Gentiles and Jews. And here you see one of the places where he does it, and he basically says it's just not relevant nowadays, which is a fascinating approach to go with. Not everybody obviously agrees with him, but that's his understanding of it. And he says it fits perfectly here. He has the best proof here because the whole issue is they don't keep laws. So because they don't keep laws, we have to keep them in check. If they have their own systems to keep them in check, then it doesn't matter, right? Then we don't have to obligate them. Or theoretically, we could say we treat them as re'ehu, and they're just like Jews. And, we pay them, they pay us. And, it's all fun. So that's an interesting note an interesting point to take. So now the Gemara is going to bring a braita to prove what we just saw. We had two opinions, meaning each one brought a different pasuk, whether it's they didn't keep the Torah or they didn't keep the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. Again, not keeping the Torah doesn't mean they were given the Torah. To keep it means they were given the Torah to be offered the Torah. They didn't want it. The 7 Mitzvot B'nai Noach, they were actually given. They just didn't keep them. So now, Tanya Nami Hachi, here's a braita to prove this reading. Shor Yisrael shenagach shor Kanani patur, shor Kanani shenagach shor Yisrael. Bein tam bein muam b'shenem lezek shalem. Same law, right? They'll either be exempt or they'll be right. We're exempt from paying them. They have to pass full damages. How do we get this? And the braita says exactly what these two rabbis said. Shene'emar amov yimoded eretz ra'av yater goyim ve'omer hopia mehal paran. And they bring both psukim. So the Gemara wants to know, right? Rabbi Bava brought one, Rabbi Yochanan brought the other, and the braita, which comes before Rabbi Bava and Rabbi Yochanan, who are Amoraim, it brought both. So they want to know, why did it bring both? Isn't one enough? My v'omer, why do you have both psukim? If you want to say, hi, amavi moded eretz mibayle l'chid Rav Matna l'chid Rav Yosef. Well, the first pasuk we brought is actually interpreted by Rav Matna and Rav Yosef in two different ways, which means if you go with their interpretation of that pasuk, then you can't interpret it the way we just did, and that's why they bring the second pasuk. So now that's why Tashma will bring you Hofia Mehar Paran, just in case you decide to follow their interpretation of the first pasuk. So then we can learn Mi Paran Hofia Mamonan Yisrael, and then you get to the same conclusion. So now the Gemara obviously wants to know how did Rav Matna interpret the pasuk, and how did Rav Yosef interpret the pasuk. My de Rav Matna, de Amar Rav Matna, Amad Yimoded Eretz Ra'ah V'Yater Goyim. Ma Ra'ah, what did God see? Ra'ah Sheva Mitzvot Shenitztavu Alehem B'nai Noach V'lo Kimum. The first part is the same thing. God saw they weren't keeping 7 Noahide laws. Amad v'higla otam me'alad matam. Vayater, I told you in the beginning, vayater is not clear what it means, right? We explained it as vayater, right, as God loosened their money, that their money can now go to Jews, right? Or they don't have to pay money, right? The Jews don't have to pay them money. But amad v'higla otam me'alad matam. Vayater is he loosened it, meaning he sent them away. He sent them out of their countries. He exiled them. Where do you have this? That vayater is to be exiled. So our pasuk. Okay, this is a verse about shratzim, about what you can eat and not eat. Okay, and then it says from the birds. Okay, the ones who have these wings above their legs, the kra'ayim on top of their legs, linater a certain way that they can linater ala aretz. So what does that mean? Mitargem lekapse bahon al aretz. They explain it as to jump on the land. So to jump, what is to jump? Well, jump could also mean to jump out of the land. That God made them jump out, meaning He exiled them. My de Rav Yosef, how did he interpret the pasuk? Rav Yosef, Amab Yimoded Eretz Ra'ah v'chulei. Ma Ra'ah Sheva Mitzvot shekiblu alehem b'nei Noach v'lo kimum. Again, beginning same pasuk, beginning of the same thing. Saw they weren't keeping the laws. Amad v'hitiran lahem. Now, what is lahatil? Lahatir, we see all the time in the Gemara. It means to permit. God permitted them and said, you know what? You're not commanded anymore in the 7 Noahide laws. That's a bit strange. Itgar, what? We're going to reward them? They didn't keep the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. Now we'll give them a reward and say, okay, you didn't keep the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. Now you don't have to. In Kamma, tzinu chotei niskal. Well then, right, someone who sins is actually going to be rewarded. That would be ridiculous, right? Unless you don't do something, so then God says, okay, it's permitted. Well, I'm a marborid Ravna, lomar shafilu mekaymin otam ein mekablim alehem sachar. What it means is, if you're not commanded, well, then you won't get rewarded for it at all. So basically, right, at some point in history, they stopped keeping the laws. God said, fine, then you know what? You're not commanded. So if you do decide to keep them, you won't even get any reward. To which the Gemara says, velo, and this is going to be our topic for the next little while, about reward, that you should get rewarded for anything you do if it's something good. Velo, vahatanya, Rabbi Meir Omer, minayin shafilu nochri, v'osek b'torah, shu kekohen gadol. is an exaggerated statement because he obviously can't be a Kohen Gadol, but let's explain and then I'll tell you what's exaggerated. Rabbi Meir says, how do you know that if you have a Gentile who keeps Torah or learns Torah, there's a debate. Do we mean keep Torah? Do we mean do mitzvot? However we understand this, he's like a Kohen Gadol. Now, obviously, he can't be a Kohen Gadol. A Kohen Gadol is born into Kehuna. You obviously can't be a Gentile and become a Kohen Gadol. But basically what it means is, wow, it's great that you're doing mitzvot. Talmud lamal asher yasehu atam ha'adam v'chai b'hem. In other words, it says who you're going to do the mitzvot and you will live by them. You will get rewarded by doing the mitzvot. They will help you to survive. Kohanim Levim Yisraelim lo ne'amar el adam. Notice what it says in that pasuk. It doesn't say a Jew. It says aseh otam ha'adam. Ha'adam isn't any kind of person, right? So that would mean it's a universal term, the term Adam. And from there you can infer that anyone can use the mitzvah to live by them, meaning they'll get rewarded if they do mitzvah. So how can you possibly say that God uncommanded them to do the mitzvah and they will no longer get rewarded for them? So Amrei, what do they answer? Once God uncommanded them, then they could no longer get the benefits, the higher level of benefit of one who's commanded to do a mitzvah and keeps the mitzvah. They go down a level to one who is no longer commanded. They still will get rewarded, but it won't be as much reward as someone who's commanded. As Rabbi Chanina says, Rabbi Chanina, Gadol ha-mitzvah b'yoseh, yoter mi she'eino mitzvah b'yoseh. It's the greater reward goes to the one who's commanded rather than the one who's not commanded and does it anyway, right? This is why it's always easier to wash someone else's dishes when you're in their house than to wash your own dishes. Your own dishes you have to wash. You hate to do chores in your own house, but it's always fun to do it. At least, I don't know, I find it very easy to do it in someone else's house because I could just do as much as I want and stop whenever I want. And, it's not my responsibility. So it's much easier. So anyway, that's a principle we've already discussed. We learned it in Kiddushin, specifically when we talked about women being exempt from certain mitzvot. They still get rewarded, but the reward is less because they're not commanded to do it and they can opt in and opt out, right? Makes a lot of sense. Okay, now we get to our story. So what we did so far is we talked about the fact that something doesn't make so much sense here. We made it make sense by basically saying, since they didn't either accept the Torah or didn't keep the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, God decided to make their money ours, right? Whatever that means. It could mean either that we don't have to pay them damages if we damage their shore, or it means the opposite, which is they have to pay us, even though theoretically they really didn't need to. Okay, and then we saw other interpretations possible of the first pasuk of the Noahide laws, and with that we talked about how they still do get rewarded if they do something, and that's going to be a topic that we're going to get to very soon. Talk about it a little bit more. We're going to sort of jump off topic into people getting rewarded for maybe small things they did, okay, or Gentiles getting rewarded. But right now we're going to go into a story which either really happened. We're going to see about 2 Roman officers who come to learn Torah, and there's a nice footnote in the Quran which talks about how in the times with the Romans, we fought against the Romans a lot, but then at a certain point, they wanted to actually appreciate our Torah and they wanted to learn from us. And this story possibly comes from, in a historical context in that time when they were interested in learning from us. Or alternatively, it could be the story never really happened, but it's bringing here a story, right? Why do you tell stories? You tell stories to highlight a point. This story clearly highlights the difficulty with this halacha it seems very a lack of inequality here. How could it possibly be that they have to pay us damages, but we don't have to pay them damages? It's very, right? And it shows, in my mind, the way I understand the story is it really shows the rabbi's struggle with this halacha. So let's read the story. Tanu Rabbanan, ukvar shalcha malchut Romi, shnei sardiotot. Okay, those are 2 Roman officers. So the Roman government sent over 2 officers, Etzel Chachmei Israel, to the Jewish sages, and said, Linduni Toratchem, please teach us your Torah. They learned all the Torah. They learned it a second time. They learned it a third time. Some people say this means they learned Torah, Mishnah, Gemara. Okay, they sat there and learned for a while. We don't know how long. It must have taken them a long time. Bishat ptiratam, when they went to go back to the Romans and I guess either teach them the Torah or bring back what they learned. Amru lahem, So they say to the rabbis, we learned all your Torah. Wow, it's real truth, your Torah. We have one problem, right? Of everything we learned, one issue. What is it? Our topic. מה שאתם אומרים, זה שאתם אומרים, שור של ישראל שנגח שור של כנעני פטור, ושל כנעני שנגח שור של ישראל, באין טעם באין מורא, משלם נזק שלם. We just don't get that halacha. How could it possibly be? You don't have to pay us, but we have to pay you full damages? This doesn't make sense. Miman nafshach. And then they clearly learned Torah well. They know how to make a miman nafshach argument. Either which way you look at it, Irehu dafka afilu de knani, ki nagach Yisrael lipater. Right? If you take Re'ehu seriously and we're not Re'ehu, so then even a Kanani, we shouldn't have to pay you. And if Re'ehu is not Dafka and it means anybody, well, then you should pay us. So we don't understand. And the story ends with Davar ze ein anu modi'im u'tal malchut. Well, we like you a lot, so we're not going to tell the Romans about this. Okay, we'll keep this as a secret between us. We will not turn you in. Okay, that's one interpretation. Some people say that no, this last line is not said by the Roman officers. This line was said by the Jews to themselves. They said, we're not going to tell you the reason for this because you'll kill us if we do. Because what's the reason? Basically, you're an immoral people, right? You have no moral values, you have no anything, and therefore, God took away your rights and gave us your money. You start saying that to the Romans, they're not going to feel very good about it. So there's a debate about how to read this last line. Again, however you read this source, it clearly shows the rabbi's discomfort with this halacha. There's all sorts of questions asked about this. First of all, there's a few interesting things I want to point out about the sugya in general. The thing about Adam, and Adam being a universal term, Tosafot raises a question because there's a pasuk, Adam ki amut ba'ohel, and that's all about if a person dies in a tent, and it talks about tumat ohel. And we know that Gentiles, their tumah is not they don't have tumat ohel. That's their bones are not metameh like ours are. There's a whole something else about, rabbinic, but from a Torah level, they're not metameh at all. And he says, how could that be? So he differentiates between Adam and Ha'adam. Ha'adam is a universal term. Adam could still mean only a Jew. That's one thing. When it says that they taught the Jews Torah, Tosafot says here, how could it be? It says in Chagiga, you're not allowed to teach Torah to Gentiles. So they suggest two possible answers. Either they were going to kill them if they didn't, or, and it was therefore pikuach nefesh, or they said they wanted to convert, and because they were going to convert, so then you could teach a Gentile Torah. But the Yam Shel Shlomo says on this, if it was danger, then theoretically you could have, they could have lied and just not told them this halacha, right? Or lied about the halacha. So the Yam Shel Shlomo says from here you learn that you can't lie about divrei Torah, like even if it's going to cost your life. You have to be honest about it, and you have to be straightforward, and you can't try to, lie and say the halacha is not what the halacha is, which is just interesting in and of itself. Okay, so very interesting sugya, very interesting to see. Number one, the Meiri, who basically very much modifies this halacha to the extent that it really doesn't exist in his time anymore, which would probably be relevant in most places nowadays. Again, you might say there are some people who still have no real ethical or moral code, but for the majority of Gentiles, this wouldn't actually apply if you take the Meiri lahalacha. And then we have again the rabbi's discomfort with this as expressed in the story that we saw. Okay, now we're moving on to another very interesting topic, which very peripherally connects to our topic. It's going to be, what do you say when you get to a mourner's house, particularly if it's a tragic shiva, which is unfortunately very relevant to us nowadays. So we're going to get to it. You'll see at the end, it's going to connect about Gentiles being rewarded for something. It's a little different than what we've seen before, but that's what we're going to get to. And from there, we're going to get off on that kind of that tangent. So we have a story here. Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, Shchiva leBarta, his daughter died. So usually when someone's daughter dies, that's a tragedy, right? We assume the daughter died young if the father's still alive. So it was a very tragic situation. Amrule Rabbanan Ulla. The rabbis say to Ulla, you have to remember, Ulla was one of the Nechute. Those are the people who went from Israel to Babylonia and brought the Torah of Israel to Babylonia. But he was an Israeli. He goes with the Babylonians. The Babylonians say, come pay a Shiva call with us. And he says, no way, no how. So I'm not going with you. What, me and you in a shiva house? You guys say, what do you call it? Gidufa. It's I forget the word. Like against God. It's I can't think of how to translate that word right now. But it's what you say is heretical. You make these heretical statements when you go to a shiva. Blasphemy. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. What you do is blasphemy. Okay, let's hear what they say. The Babylonian rabbis say blasphemy at a shiva. Right? This is all about how you interpret something. Okay, so he said, the Amre, you guys say, my efshar the man. What can we do? That's what you say. You know, often that's right. You go into a shiva nowadays, a tragic, horrible shiva of a young soldier killed or whoever it might be. You walk in and you say, I have no words, right? What can I do, right? We have nothing to do. It's kind of a common saying, actually. So what's the problem with it? Well, he says it implies that if you could have done something, you would have. It means, okay, so let's try to understand this. The best interpretation I saw was that it's like comparing it to, imagine you were talking about a king who was alive, right? And especially in those days, the kings were very cruel and didn't treat the Jews properly. And, let's say they took someone out to be killed who wasn't deserving of death. And you would say, well, what can I do? I couldn't fight against them. They're the king. There's nothing I could have done, which sounds like you don't agree with what they did. And you don't believe that there was any reason, any justification. And you're going against the king. It's basically, you're saying something against the king's rule. You're saying that king, So if you say that about God, that's pretty blasphemous. So he says, I'm not going with you. So he goes on his own. So he basically says, the way you say that, when you say, what can we do? I understand that is blasphemy. Now, obviously, they didn't think that. They thought that was an appropriate thing to say, because what you're basically saying is, we don't have anything to say, it's tragic. And, we lift up our hands and say, we don't understand. But he understood it as blasphemy. So he decides, I'm not going to pay a shiva call with you. I don't want to be there when you say your heretical, blasphemous statements. So he goes by himself. Now I want you to judge whether you think his statement is any better than their statement or has other issues. This is what he says to Shmuel bar Yehuda, who's mourning his daughter. Vayomer Hashem, he speaks to, I think it's Vayomer Hashem Eli, which is to Moshe. I have in parentheses El Moshe, just so you know he was talking to Moshe. Al tatzeret Moav al tidgar b'milchama. Okay, in the beginning of Sefer Devarim, God says, don't put a siege, don't besiege the Moavites, and don't start up with them with a war. Why is he saying to Moshe, don't go waging war? Well, Moshe was going to just decide on his own to wage war against the Moavites? Well, Moshe made a kavachomer on his own. I know you're wondering, where is this going? Okay, you'll see. This is like a good long rabbi speech, right? He starts off with the whole thing, and eventually we'll get there. Well, the Midyanim lo ba'u ela lazor et Moav. So the Midyanim, what happened in the end of Sefer Bamidbar? Balak ben Zippor, right? He wants the king of Moab. He wants to curse the Jews. He brings in Bil'am, and then it's unsuccessful. He brings in all these girls, women, liznot, right? Prostitutes, to get the Jews to sin. They end up sinning. And among the Moabites came also Midyanim. Now, they didn't start the problem, the Midyanim. And yet, at the end of Sefer Bamidbar, it says, go round up the Midyanim and fight against them, God tells them. So the Midyanim lo ba'u ela la'azor et Moav. They were just secondary. They were accessories to the whole thing that was going on there. And yet the Torah said, God said, collect them, right? Go fight against them. Moavim atzmam lo koshaken. So now turning to Amud Bet, right? Moshe's kavachomer is obviously them, the Midyanim, the Moavim, we should fight against. They were the ones who instigated the whole thing. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now here comes the main point. Lo k'shal ta'adat chal tal dati. I look at things differently. I have a different perspective than you. I have two important people, two important women, okay? Predot, they say fledglings that are going to come in, like young ones that are going to be born from them. Ruth HaMoaviyah and Naamah HaAmonit. Ruth HaMoaviyah, who gives birth to David, King David. Naamah HaAmonit, who gives birth to Rechavam, who's the king, right, the son of Shlomo. V'halot v'ha'im kavachomer. And we can make a kal v'chomer here. Uma b'shvil shtei pleidot tovot. Now here comes his big line. You ready? Take a deep breath. Uma shtei pleidot tovot chas hakadosh baruch hu al shtei umot gedolot v'lo hechrivan. If for these two women that were going to come out of Moav and Midian, Moav and Ammon, God said, don't destroy them. Bito shel Rebbe, the daughter of this rabbi, okay, you Shmuel bar Yehuda, im ksherahi u'reuyahi latzet mimena davar tov al acha kamma v'kamma dahava chaya. Whoa, this is a difficult line, okay? He thought that was blasphemous. This is very insulting to Shmuel bar Yehuda. He says, if she was kshera and reuyah, if she was worthy and a good person, almost he sounds like he's saying, then something good would have, right? She would have had children. And the fact that apparently this woman must have died without children, alacha kamma v'kamma, she would have lived. And therefore, because, right, no one was going to end up coming out of her that was worthy. And therefore, you shouldn't be too upset about this. That sounds like I'd be much more upset by hearing that. But the best explanation I understood from reading this is that that's not really what he meant to say. Okay, and we can read it a little bit differently. What he meant to say is, and this is in a very positive way, that she fulfilled her role in this world. Like what he was saying about the Amon and Moav is that they had a purpose to fulfill in the world, and therefore they couldn't have been destroyed until their purpose was fulfilled. So God said, don't kill them. But she might not have had children, but she fulfilled a different purpose in this world. Okay, if she was supposed to have children, she would have had children. Instead, she had a different purpose, and her purpose in life was complete. So you should know, right? Understand that her role in this world was complete, and with that, you should have nechama. Okay, and that's right to say it in those words. Thank you. She left none of her potential unfulfilled. Okay, that's a very nice way to see. Okay, you could read it both ways. I mean, it's hard to read the first way because it's really hard to imagine that he thought that was better, right? Again, one was. And if you think about it, now there's actually a debate in the commentaries in the halacha about what you're supposed to say at a shiva house. Are you supposed to go like the Babylonian rabbis, or are you supposed to go like Ulla? So the Yam Shel Shlomo says that even if you can understand the statement of Ulla in a positive way, it still could come off as offensive. And this happens, unfortunately, very often, and particularly in tragic shivas, where people say things that they think are being helpful and they're really not, and they really are offensive to the family. So while you might mean well, it comes off sounding really horrible. And therefore, he says you shouldn't go with Ulla. But the Raman, the Shulchan Aruch, okay, and in Yoredea Siman Shin Ayin Vav, actually paskins like Ulla. And he says the following: you should not say, Ma yesh ma lecha lasot, right? What could we have done? Okay, because that is giduf. He says that's blasphemous. Okay, because it sounds like if we could have changed, we should have. But he doesn't exactly say that you should say Ulla. He says, Eli kabel alav gzerat Hashem yitbarach me'ahava. You should accept the gzerah of God with love, which possibly, it sounds like he's saying, because he's not choosing that, but he is choosing Ulla, and that he views that as accepting God's decree with love and saying, it must be that she fulfilled her potential, and therefore, I should feel good about it. Okay. Again, this is a very complicated topic. Just like the first topic, there's no good answer really, which is, what's the right thing to say? Often it's better to say very little, because sometimes what you might say, what it also highlights is that often what you might say either will be insulting to God or will be insulting to the people who you're trying to console. And the whole point is to go to console the mourner and not to obviously offend them. So you have to be cautious. Okay. But why is this here? This is here because of the reward that the Moabites, who were terrible people and just did terrible things to Jewish people, but because there was something good going to come out of them, they were spared. So in that note, God will never not give a reward for something that someone's deserving of, even any creature, basically. It means not even just, right, obviously Jews, right? And this is also going back to, by the way, the other thing they're getting at here, and that's how we got here in the first place, is that sometimes there's, right, just like Jews get rewarded, also Gentiles get rewarded. So afilu schar sichana, even by speaking nicely, okay, to how important speech is and choosing your words carefully. Ti'ilu bechira de ka'amra Moav, okay, if you remember the daughters of Lot, after seeing Sodom destroyed, they were worried that the whole world was destroyed, and they said, wait a minute, what are we going to do now? The world is destroyed. There's no one for us to marry. So they slept with their father, which is obviously a terrible sin. But we're going to see that they even view it as something positive because they actually had good intentions. They really wanted to populate the world, which was a mitzvah, and it was important. They had the right intentions, but obviously the bad actions. But they point out here a difference between the older one and the younger one. The older one called her son Moav, which says from my father. That's what Moav is, Me'av, from my father. That's not sichana. That's not a nice way. You don't want to go parading it around that this is what you did. And therefore, Amar lo kadosh baruch hu Moshe, al tatzeret Moav, al tidgar b'milchama. So God says to Moshe, don't besiege the city and don't wage war against them. Now notice what it says. Milchamahu delo ha'angaria avibihu. You shouldn't wage war with them, but it does sound like you can take them to be your slaves. You can conquer them and say, okay, now you're going to work for us. Just don't kill them. Si'ira de ka'amra ben ami, amar lekadina. She said, son of my nation. Now that already maybe means, okay, you're from my, I slept with my father, but it's not as blatant and out there. You can interpret it in all sorts of ways. And so therefore, Hamar Kadosh Baruch Hu Moshe, and here's the reward she got for this. Because when you get near Ammon, don't besiege them and don't start up with them at all. Okay, meaning not even to take them as slaves. Don't take them as slaves, don't make them work for you. So you see that she got rewarded for better speech. But Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, La'olam yagdim adam lidvar mitzvah, shebishvil laila echad shekidamta bechira letzira, kidamta arba dorot l'Yisrael. This is a fascinating one. Even though, like I said, they did a sin, it was terrible that they slept with their father, but on the other hand, they had good intentions, and they wanted to do a mitzvah, which was to procreate, to have children. So in a time of destruction. So basically, Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, this you learn from the older one, okay, who we just kind of said was bad in the way she spoke, but she actually went one night, she went and did the mitzvah first. She was the first one to go. And because she went first and rushed ahead to do what she thought was a mitzvah, again, it wasn't exactly a mitzvah, but to a certain extent, it's viewed here as a mitzvah, she got 4 generations earlier into the Jewish people. Ovad, Yishai, David, Shlomo, right? Those were the generations. It starts from Ovad, then Yishai, then David and Shlomo. Ovad was the first child of Reuben and Boaz. And then Yishai, David, then Shlomo. Ve'ilu tzirad rechavam. In other words, it took 5 generations till the 5th generation, the son of Shlomo, who married the Ammonite, where the Ammonim came into the Jewish people. Dichtiv v'shemi mon Ammonite. So for 1 day earlier, she got 4 generations earlier into the Jewish people. So here you see the rewards that people get for small actions, or whether you call them small or big, but any kind of reward. And here you see, and maybe it's also a way of equalizing and saying even Gentiles, even people who we have a lot to gripe about, the Moavim, who tried to, kill us and curse us and got us all to sin, and yet there's redeeming qualities about them. So it's also, and on one hand, we got into this issue of sachal and how anyone can get rewarded for things, and Gentiles, and then, it really was kind of the balance to the sugya about the Gentiles and the money issue. Well, maybe there, yes, but, they obviously can do things that are valuable and get rewarded for them. Maybe not as much because they're not commanded, again, depending on how you view that. Okay, now we're moving on to Kuti. Kutim are the Shomonim, if you remember. They're the people who, in the Assyrian exile, when they took the Jews out of the Malchut Yisrael, there was the Malchut Yisrael, the Israelite kingdom and the Judean kingdom. The Judean kingdom outlived, and was only destroyed with the destruction of the temple. But before that, there was the Assyrian Galut. And they took, if you remember, they took the Jews out and they moved other people to live here. And then once they did that, the people that were living here these lions came and started killing them. And then they brought a Kohen to teach them the laws. And then they started keeping the laws. But they didn't exactly keep the laws in the same way. They have a bunch of big different, distinctions, like the temple's not in Jerusalem. It's in Har Gerizim. That's the sanctified place according to them. They have a whole bunch of differences. And it also says in the text there, Malachim, they also didn't really worship God. Okay, they didn't really believe in God. So it's a bit of a question either. And there's a whole debate whether you view them as real converts, like they really converted for good reasons, or did they convert because they were scared of lions and they were just scared of dying? And then that's converting for the wrong reason. Now, If you say they're gerei arayot, they converted for the wrong reason, then we don't accept them as converts. This raises a whole question. If someone converts for the wrong reason, again, obviously you don't have to say what is the wrong reason why someone could convert. But if you define something as the wrong reason, then are they not converts? So Rabbeinu Tam, I think it's Rabbeinu Tam who says, even if, right, okay, it says, if you convert for the wrong reasons, but you fully convert, then you're Jewish. If you convert for the wrong reasons, and it says in the pasuk there, et Hashem hayu yireim ve'et Elohem hayu ovdim. Okay, they both fear God, but also worship idols. So you can't do that. In other words, that's not a conversion. If you're going to convert and basically also still worship idols, then you're not Jewish. Okay, but if you convert for the wrong reasons, but keep the Jewish mitzvot, obviously you have to, what does it mean to keep them? Keep all of them, right? But that's a basic fundamental, worshiping idols. So if you're going to worship idols and while you're converting, that doesn't work. Okay, and then that's how you have to view it. But if you convert it for the wrong reasons, whatever that might be, but you're Jewish, you're keeping the Jewish laws and you believe in God and don't worship idols, then you would be accepted, even if you did it for the wrong reason. So that's also an interesting point he makes. So now the question is, where do we view these kutim? And therefore, what's going to be the halacha if your ox gores theirs or they gore yours? So, shor tanu Rabbanan, the Braita says, shor shel Yisrael shenagach shor shel kuti patur, v'shel kuti shenagach shor shel Yisrael. So first of all, your ox gores theirs, you're exempt. Sounds like they're Gentiles, right? But notice what it says here. Shel kuti shenagach shor shel Yisrael, tam meshalem chatzi nezek u'muad meshalem nezek shalem. If their ox gores yours, if it was a tam, they pay half damages. If it was a muad, they pay full damages. Well, that already sounds like Jewish. So it's confusing. Rabbi Meir omer, shor shel Yisrael shenagach shor shel kuti patur, shel kuti shenagach shor shel Yisrael, bein tam bein muad meshalem nezek shalem. So Rabbi Meir seems to treat them 100% like a Gentile. And that's the opinion we're going to try to figure out right now. Okay, so the Gemara says, and the truth is we're really not going to deal with Tana Kamma much at all. They want to understand. L'meimer t'savar Rabbi Meir kutim kirei arayotem? Is it because he didn't think they were real legit converts? And because he didn't think they were real legit converts, he treated them exactly like Gentiles? Okay, that would make the most sense. What's the problem? It contradicts another source. Urimini. Kolak tamim abim mirekem tohorim. Rabbi Meir mitamem b'pnei she'en gerim v'toim. Okay, let's stop for a minute. If you have a clothing with a blood stain on it, and you don't know, was the blood stain from menstrual bleeding or not? You don't know, is it impure or not? So what do you do? If it comes from Rechem, so the Tana Kamma says they're all toholim because most people who lived in Rechem were not Jewish. So you can assume it came from a non-Jew, and their menstrual blood does not make their clothes impure. But so it's a halacha only for Jews, this issue of stains from blood stains on it. Like if the issue that we see something with blood stain on it, if we assume it's from a Jew, then we can assume it came from menstrual bleeding, and we should be strict about it, even though we don't really know for sure. So Rabbi Yehuda mitamem mipnei she'en gerim v'toim says the people. This isn't relevant yet, by the way, because this isn't talking about kutim. These are people who live in Rechem, which was a border town. You might remember it from Gitin, Rechem Kimizrach, Rechem Kimizrach, about where we treat what's in the borders of Israel and not. So it was a border town, and he says they were Jewish. They just were people who messed up halacha a lot. They didn't know all the halacha, but they were Jewish. They were converts. Mi ben hanochrim tohorim, if it's among Gentiles, a definite Gentile city, then it would be tahor. Mi ben Yisrael, mi ben akutim, Rabbi Meir mitameh v'chachamim mitaharim, shelo nechshedu al kitmehem. Okay, the Gemara in Nida sort of explains this in a bit of a different way, not the simple reading, but for our purposes, we're just going to keep it like this, which is he puts the kutim with the Yisrael. There's a bit of a distinction he makes, but Rabbi Meir basically says their stuff is tameh. Okay, there's about inside and outside, and I'm not going to get into all the details there, but the main point is, Alma kasavar Rabbi Meir kutim girei ametim. He basically says they're like real legit converts. So, because he treats a stain that comes from them is going to be treated the same as the Jewish one. So that means we basically treat them as Jews. So how could he, in this case, treat them as Gentiles, and in the other case, treat them as Jews? To which I'm a Rabbi Abba. Now, even though he said these were Jews who had a whole different, as we know, if you ever met Shomernim or you can go meet them in Israel, they have a lot of halachot that they keep very differently than us. And we've had sugyot about them that talked about them also, about all sorts of things that they do differently, or they're not careful about certain things. And therefore he didn't want us marrying them. Okay, they might be considered Jews, but you shouldn't marry them because they have a whole different way of understanding Judaism. And therefore, he basically distinguished in this halacha to keep us separated from them. If they know that we're treating them differently, they're not going to want to marry us. And that's exactly what he wanted. So now they ask one last question, not to Rabbi Zera, but wait, Elu na'alot sheyesh lahem knas. And this Tannaitic source, it says, these are women that you have to pay knas if you rape them. What is that? Habala mamzeret, even though you're not supposed to marry a mamzeret, but if you rape her, you have to pay the knas. Ala nitina, also on nitinim, nitino. Ala kutit, if you rape a kutit, you have to pay the knas. V'isa kadata knas Rabbi Meir b'mamonan, hachanami niknas shelo yitamu behen. Maybe also we should say, you raped, okay, this sounds pretty horrible, and luckily we don't say this. Oh, you raped a kutit? Yes, she's Jewish, but they don't really keep the halachot, and we don't want you to marry them. So let's just say you don't have to pay them. And that, again, will create this tension between us and the kutim, and we won't intermarry. To which Amar Abaye, Kadesh lo yechoten iska. But in that case, you rape this woman, we don't want you to benefit and not have to pay her the knas. Okay, you can ask the same question about the ox, but the ox is different because you didn't actually do a sin. You just didn't protect your animal enough and your animal damaged. This is you actually did something way worse, which is you raped someone. There, we're not going to let you get away with it. We see again the same thing we saw earlier in the daf about someone who sins getting rewarded. Okay, so we don't want to let you get away with murder, or in this case, get away with rape, and therefore we're going to make you pay. But maybe don't pay her or her family. Usually it goes to the family. Don't pay the kuti, and that will create this tension between us, which Rabbi Meir is looking for. But give it to poor people, and that way you won't get rewarded, right, by sinning and raping her. But right, you won't pay her, and that way that'll create this tension. Now, if you do that, you basically won't end up paying because there's no one who can claim the money from you. No one's going to go to court and say, "Oh, I'm a poor person, and I know you owe this woman for rape, and it goes to me." And no poor person has the rights to go claim that in court. So if we don't actually have someone collecting money on the other side, you'll actually never really end up paying. And therefore, we don't let you get away with rape. But in the case of damages, since you didn't do it directly, and it was this, your animal did it, so we're actually going to distinguish, and that will create a situation where you won't intermarry. So Rabbi Meir does think that they're Jews. He just thinks that they're Jews who aren't really keeping mitzvah properly, and therefore, and again, it's not just that they're not careful about mitzvah, that they had a whole different view of religion, but it was more similar. They kept the Torah shebichtav very literally against the rabbinic tradition. It was almost like the karaim also, the tzdukim, and therefore they didn't want all this intermarriage with them, and they were, a little worse than that, and therefore this was done to prevent that. So we have very interesting sugyot today about how to treat, why this distinction with the Gentiles. What about the kutim? In the middle, we got into this other sugya about how to speak at a shiva house, what to say, what not to say. Maybe, right, don't say too much at all. Or certainly along the lines of what all these rabbis were saying, which could get you into trouble in different ways. And about that even Gentiles get rewarded for their actions, and that God looks, at the bigger picture. A lot of interesting things for today. Wishing everybody a Hanukkah Sameach. Hoping for a quieter week this week. And like I said in the beginning of the Shiur, there's no Zoom tomorrow. The Shiur will be up early, and we'll resume up the Zoom on Tuesday.